guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be making the iconic dress that Wednesday wears in the new TV show when she does that whole dance scene. And for this project, the fabric I'm going to use I got off of Fabric Wholesale Direct. And the first one I'm showing you is 5 yards of their poplin fabric. And this one here is 12 yards of their crystal organza. And I will also go ahead and link this fabric in the description box too. And so this was the sketch that I drew up for this project. The hardest part was figuring out like what her skirt actually looked like. I couldn't find like any clear photos online. I couldn't find any videos of it. Eventually, after scouring the internet for a really long time, I found like one of those like behind the scenes videos. And there was a tiny little clip of her like twirling around on it that I think she posted on like her story or something that somebody saved. So I was very lucky to come across that because that image honestly came in clutch. But right now what you guys see here is I'm cutting out the lining pieces first. And so all of my front pieces I'm cutting twice the amount out of this fabric because half of them are going to be for my lining of the lining, if that makes sense. And right now I'm also only cutting the pieces for the bodice. And for this dress, I also decided to make it into separate, so I'm making the top and the skirt separately. That's kind of what it looked like she had to me because I didn't really know where to put in a zipper, and the front already had like buttons down it, so I wanted to make them usable and not have also a zipper in the back that you would see. So that's how I decided to tackle this whole dress. It was a really fun project, but the hardest part was just like finding enough information and references to make it off of because whenever I do these kinds of things, I really want to make them as precise as I possibly can because I'm just a perfectionist and I want it to look like the original. But that's just me. You really, honestly, nobody has to go as detailed as I care to do. I really shouldn't myself. But now I'm cutting out my pieces for the front also out of the crystal organza. And as you saw, I'm doing princess seams for the lining fabric. But then on the organza, I decided to do just darts on the front and cut out these like big pieces instead. I don't know if that was the smartest way to go about this, but I thought that would be easiest. And it obviously worked out well enough, so. And then the only pieces left to cut out were just an absolute ton of ruffles. I cut out so many ruffles for this project. I really should have gotten a ruffling foot for my machine before I did all of this, but it is what it is, it's fine. And I'm assembling the bodice the same way that I do in most of my videos, where I'm taking my center piece, which has been cut into two so I can make it a button up, and putting one of my sides down either side edge of it and sewing those together. And like I said, I'm making two of those so that one of them can be the lining. And then for the back, I just cut out really big rectangles, and I'm adding darts in them now to bring it in a little bit at the waist so that it fits my back nicely. And I'm just sewing all of those across. And as you guys can kind of see in these clips, and even when I was cutting out my pieces, I'm always referencing things off of my own body as I go. So I'm constantly trying on the pieces, I'm constantly taking my own measurements. That's just a part of my creative process because I don't use patterns. And so here is what those bodice pieces look like once the backs have been sewn to the front, and this is the first like real try-on of it. And the pieces fit really well. I just made the bodice too long so it wasn't fitting around like my hips because obviously it was the measurement for my waist. So I think I just cut that down a bit and then I sewed the two bodice pieces together all across the top edge to get a finished seam. And don't mind my phone in the way of some of these. I also made a TikTok of it. So that's why you'll see my phone in a lot of these shots. And now I'm working on the organza pieces because this is going to go over the bodice pieces that we did just sew. And like I said, I'm putting darts in. So on the back, it's gonna be about the same darts that we did on the lining piece. And then on the front, the darts are honestly pretty similar to the ones on the back. They're just going to stop like right underneath my chest so that again, it brings it into my waist. And while I'm doing those, I'm putting them on top of each other and referencing them all to make sure that they all look exactly the same because organza likes to shift a lot while you're working with it. It's notoriously not a very easy fabric to work with. It's kind of a pain, but it always looks really pretty, so we stick it out. And I also did top stitch all of the darts down as well because I wanted it to just lay flatter. And when sewing all of my other seams on the organza, I was also doing French seams to help with all of the fraying. And now on this step, what you see here is I'm taking that lining bodice that we made and I'm pinning it inside of the organza one, and then trying it on to reference it and make sure that there's no like weird gaps or bubbles or anything like that. Put tons and tons of pins in it to make sure it's laying really flat. And then I'm just going to top stitch across the top of the lining onto the organza to put those pieces together. And then I had to stop really quick and sew up one of Basil's toys because it had a hole in it and she really wanted to play with it. And then I tried it on again and it was fitting really nicely. So I was starting to get pretty excited at this point. And that was the first day of work. So when I came back to it the next day, I decided to start putting on the sleeves. And the sleeves were surprisingly tricky. I actually did 2 tries of these. I don't know if I filmed the second pair because the step was the same, but I ended up cutting these on the bias after I did the first ones because it was really uncomfortable and I wasn't able to move my arms freely. So then I redid it and I cut my sleeves on the bias and then assembled them the exact same way. And they fit much better and it was way more comfortable to wear. But for those sleeves, I basically just fold them in half, sew across the smaller edge, and then put basting stitches all across the like rounded top edge of my sleeve. And I gather it just slightly so that it will fit in my armhole. And then I pin it together and sew all the way around. And again, I was doing French seams, so what that means exactly is I was putting my pieces wrong sides together first, sewing all around it, cutting my seams really short, and then folding the piece so that it was pretty side to pretty side, and then sewing around the edge again so that I'm like encasing my seam. And this really helps with fraying. Sometimes I also top stitch that down after I've already sewn it twice. So it takes a really long time, but it just is way more secure when you're working with this kind of fabric. And then after the sleeves were done, I just added in my little like button placket for where the buttons are gonna go on the dress. And so that was encasing the raw edges on the front. And before I started actually sewing the button placket, I decided to cut a second piece of it out of my organza fabric and baste it to the lining piece so that it would look the same. It would still have that like shimmer effect over it and it would match the rest of the bodice. And then I just sewed it on how you would on like a regular button-up shirt. And then after that, I went ahead and made my collar, again doing the whole basting the organza over top of the lining so it looks the same. And I also used interfacing to make it sit a little bit nicer. And again, I was just assembling this whole part of it how you would on any regular button-up shirt. And then I just attached it around the neckline of the dress. And I also, again, top stitched like all of these edges down to make them look really nice and professional. It's 2 a.m. and I just killed the biggest mosquito I've ever seen, but the top is done except for the ruffles, so pretty exciting. And then it was time to add in all of those ruffles. I used so many rounds of bobbin for this because first I had to sew all of the ruffles together into a long big strip, and then I tried to figure out the best technique to hem them all quickly. And so here you can see I was trying to use my rolled hem foot, but it just wasn't working well with the organza. It was slipping out and just it would not roll the way I wanted it to. So I ended up just putting my regular foot on and folding all of those edges over by hand. And I just decided to hem all of my ruffles before doing anything else because I knew this was going to take a really long time. I had yards and yards of ruffles to do this with. But I do have to say it was a very satisfying process. And then I had to go all across the length of them 2 more times to add the basting stitches. And when you're doing basting stitches for gathers like this, I really recommend putting in like an old bobbin that you wound for a color you haven't used in a long time. So like you can see a lot of the time mine are like reds or pinks or greens or something, because it's just a good way to use up that bobbin thread that you're not using. And so once those were all gathered and ruffled up, I started to pin them to the bodice. And for the bodice, I did 3 rows of ruffles all the way across it. And when I did reach the button placket, I would just cut them and hem the edges first before sewing them on. And when I sewed them on, the ruffles were also facing up so that I could stitch all across and then fold them down and top stitch them. Again, so I can get rid of all of those raw edges and it wouldn't fray too bad. And this wasn't hard, it was just very time consuming, which is kind of the theme of this dress. It was just a very time-consuming process, but I do have to say it was really fun, and watching all the layers go on one at a time was just so exciting. Like, I was so happy while doing this whole thing, so I was just so excited about how like big and poofy everything was getting. It was really, really fun. And at this point I also added on the buttons on the bodice before sewing on the other 2 layers of ruffles because it was already getting kind of crowded with the ruffling. And then after all of those were sewn on, the bodice was totally done and it was looking so good already. I was so excited about it. And so like I said, because these are separates, I left the top totally alone after this. It was totally done. And I really, really love how it turned out. I should honestly like style an outfit with it because it's so cute. But that meant it was finally time to tackle the skirt, which is definitely the part I was most afraid of. I wasn't sure how I was gonna get like those choppy layers that I wanted so badly. But I started just by sewing my first row of layers to an elastic waistband that I made. And honestly, the assembly of this skirt, at least for the first 2 layers, was really similar to my other like tiered skirt tutorials that I've done, where you're just kind of gathering up one layer and sewing it to the bottom of a different layer, so you get like continually more and more ruffles and layers. And then while I was sewing that to my waistband, I made sure to pull the waistband as tight as I possibly could so that it would still retain that stretch, and I sewed it on with a zigzag stitch. And you have to do it this way so that when you pull it to get it on, you're not going to break all of your stitches and it's still going to have that elasticity. And then it was the time to cut out all of the rest of my ruffled layers. And this took a lot of fabric. I thought I was gonna have a lot left over and I didn't, because ruffles take more fabric than I always think they're going to. But after they were all cut, I was just sewing them into these big loops. And the first tiers are going to be smaller than the bottom tiers because you're adding more fabric each time. So they progressively got longer and longer. But like I said, it's really just the same process of sewing them all together, adding those basting stitches in, and gathering it so that it'll fit into the bottom section of the last tier that you did, and then just sewing those together. And to kind of help out with the spacing of all of this fabric, I usually split each section into 4 quadrants and mark that with a pin before I start ruffling or pinning them together, so that I can kind of like ruffle it in these equally sized quadrants so that I know everything is going to be the same and there's not going to be like a huge amount of fabric in the back and not in the front. And after each layer, I was also serging all of the edges because it was just really, really chaotic with all of the raw edges. I think I still have like some of these fibers all over my floor. My room was literally a mess for weeks after doing this. But what I was going to say is if you don't have a serger, a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine would also help encase the edges. And then after I serged it, I had to pull out all of those basting stitches that I'd put in, especially if you are using a different colored thread like I'm showing you here, because I don't think Wednesday would want any pink in her dress. And each layer of this skirt, I just got so excited. It was like, it reminded me of all the tutus I had when I was growing up. But yeah, this whole process is just very repetitive. The only difference was for the bottom layer. I wasn't sure how I was going to get those choppy layers like I mentioned, because I really didn't want to have to hem wavy edges of organza because I knew it wasn't going to look very good. So what I did instead is I actually cut the top edge to have this wavy shape, and then I hemmed the straight edge all the way across so that when I started gathering up the wavy edge, it kind of all straightened out with the ruffles when you pull on those basting stitches. And it was actually surprisingly easy to attach to the layer above it, but the bottom edge was insanely easy to hem because it was just all a straight edge. And I was honestly like surprisingly happy with how easy this was to do. I was really, really nervous about it, but doing that wavy edge was definitely the way to go. And later I did learn that it's a lot easier to take out your basting stitches before you serge it, because that way you're not accidentally cutting those basting threads and they can all come out in one long pull. So I definitely recommend doing that instead of what I did the first time. But then at this point my serger decided to start dying on me again. I thought I had fixed it. You guys told me last time that I was having troubles, that it was the order in which I was threading my serger. It needed to be done in a specific way. And that totally worked for a while, but my serger is broken again. She's totally busted at this point and refuses to work. So I'm having my dad look at her, and then I might have to buy a new one because I just don't know why mine is always having problems. But then I had to do some more hemming because there was a lot of hemming to do on this dress. And after this was all done, I had finished the first tier and I was already exhausted. I was so sick of looking at Ruffles, but I had a whole nother tier to go. So to cut out the bottom layer, I started first with my lining fabric, and I cut out 3 circle skirts as long as I could go that would fit around my waist all together. And normally I would do 2, but it just wasn't big enough for what I wanted. So I decided to cut down the waist a little bit and make it into 3 so that the skirt could be bigger. And this actually worked really well. I assembled it pretty much the exact same way, where I just like sewed all of the side seams together into one big skirt, and it worked just fine. And also the circumference of the top of the skirt was not my waist size, but instead the largest measurement that I could stretch my elastic waistband to fit, so that I could stretch the waistband and sew it on, and that way I could just slip into the skirt. And then I just decided to do 1 layer of ruffles at the bottom of that circle skirt. So I cut out a really wide organza piece and then marked it in the center and drew another wavy line down the center of it. And then I added my 2 parallel basting stitches from there so that I could mark out a line where I wanted it to go on the big circle skirt, open up that piece so it's nice and flat, and gather it up and top stitch it directly onto that line that I had drawn. I don't really know if that makes sense, but basically doing it this way, I would get those choppy layers because I did it in that kind of wavy pattern, but also I wouldn't have any raw edges because then the other layer would just fold over and I would have 2 layers of organza and no raw edges. So I just pinned that center seam across that line and then top stitched this down. And then again, I just took out all of those basting stitches and then I folded down the fabric and top stitched it down so that everything would lay nicely. And then after that, I just had to hem all of the bottom layers of these skirts. So that was both of the organza layers and the lining skirt. But after I hemmed those layers, this skirt was totally done and it was time to put the entire thing together. You guys know that I rarely wear black, but I have to admit I felt so cool while I was modeling this outfit. And no, I did not actually dye my hair black. I just got one of those like colored hairspray things for people with grown out roots. And I just covered my entire head in it, and it took so many shampoos to get it all out, but it's just temporary. I thought it was super fun, and it's honestly kind of making me want to go back to my darker color, but that's for another day. I also want to apologize for being MIA for a while off of YouTube. I just honestly needed a little break. I've been doing YouTube for a hot minute now and I just got kind of overwhelmed and tired. So I just took a little break for a while, but I've been filming again and I have a lot of fun content that I just really need to get around to editing for you guys. So please stay tuned because I have a lot of fun stuff coming, including some more really big dresses, some van updates, and more tutorials, of course. So thank you guys so much for sticking around, and I hope to see you guys really soon. Bye!